Today I'm joined by Michael J Maguire, a writer, educator, entrepreneur, technologist, digital media artist and theorist. He's currently a senior lecturer at the Dublin Business School and course director for creative writing in a digital age, amongst a lot of other things. Join us for a talk on everything from gamification of marketing to the need to experiment with new technologies and lots more. Enjoy. So what I was going to ask you when you talked about that just now, because I understand perfectly what you're saying about people looking at or addressing the world according to their own experiences and their own worldview. But what would consist a revolution in your mind if we're not looking at it as a revolution? Is it then taking up the pitchforks and overthrowing the Facebooks and the Twitters and the Googles of the world, or the kings of the online world, so to speak?
Well, I mean, that statistic, the Oxfam surveys on poverty, etc., that show that the 1% owning more than 42% of the world's wealth. There's 8 individuals in the world that own more than half of the planet. Stuff like this, that kind of level of inequity, or that kind of level of inequality, or that type of hoarding on a planet that is burning up slowly as a result of that hoarding. I mean, there's a number of it's very convenient for us as individuals. And I mean, without getting into Monty Pythonisms and talking about you're all individuals, it's very convenient for us to point the finger at. There's a guy called Curtis White, actually, who wrote a brilliant book called The Barbarian Heart, or The Barbarian Heart. Yeah. In which he talks about this very thing. He talks about the idea that we can just point a finger at large corporations and say, look at what they are doing to the planet. Look at their emissions. And now we know it's odd that the Arabian Amco, or whatever they're called, the petrochemical company in Saudi Arabia are actually fundraising at the moment, or they're selling shares at the moment, because they are being proven to be the biggest polluter on the planet, right? So I mean, obviously, fossil fuels should all stay in the ground at this point, without any exception. So I don't know why they're obviously raising money for, as you know yourself, in our world. What tends to happen is if we have a budget, the budget is 50% development, 50% marketing, and sometimes that marketing is highly weighted towards PR, especially if you're British Petroleum digging holes in the ocean and stuff like that, So that kind of business practices and the kind of profit orientated. I think Gene Roddenberry had it right, and our old friend Lee Sheldon. On Tina G, you remember the Next Generation? That whole idea of a different sense of cashless society or whatever. So capitalism, you can't use the word socialism because it's so misunderstood, and people immediately conflate it with communism, and they immediately conflate it with the idea of bare bread shelves in supermarkets and stuff like that. Because as we all know, everybody gets everything right first time.
I think looking at the Nordic countries, it's what we have is the socialism, but on a strong foundation of capitalistic incentives and then the welfare state on top of that, which is the result of the combination of the two, in a sense.
Well, you see, just to kind of pull some of this stuff together, then. What we understand is everyone screams about, I'm not giving a Facebook my data anymore. I'm let me know about the privacy rights I have in relation to that particular downloading that app, or I won't use that particular browser because I know it tracks my, I know it tracks every keystroke, and I know it tracks, there's a heat map of where I put my cursor. So I don't want to give that information. I don't want to give that data rather out. But you see, this is what's happening. What's happening in the current kind of surveillance society is that once we sign up to these things, what we're doing is we're feeding the machine. And I mean, I have this is kind of central, I think, to everything that we speak about media today. Media and mediation and C.S. Pearson communication and all that sort of stuff, and the idea, the concepts of how do we frame media and how do we think about media. And of course, traditionally we think about owned, shared and paid media. There have been three forms of media, and now of course stolen is the fourth one, of course. And I'm sure you're familiar with the. If you ever look up the Cannes Lion 2015 winner, it's the XC60. That famous ad for the Super Bowl. So we know that. Media today is not just an interaction exercise. Media today for us is about emotional connection. It's about it's something that I explored back in 2015 when I wrote about a thing called digital vitalism, what's
that? Yeah.
Well, to me, vitalism, of course, is a very, very long tradition of understanding the human condition in terms of having some kind of vital energy, or l'âme vitale, as Henri Bergson called it, the spark of energy in yourself that animates you. The connection between us and technology at a very basic level, from it helped us kill our prey and to we built huts and created fire and etc. I'm not going to do the whole steam. But we survived with the aid of this technology. And what has happened in recent years, that I have a background in media, I have a background in theatre and multimedia and computer games. But prior to that, it was in electronics. It was in analog electronics. It was in industrial, mechanical and production engineering. It was like, now we have platforms, we have operating systems, and something that we spoke about earlier was a move from Apple to the Android, from iOS to Apple. Like what you're doing there is you're actually just moving from one product system to another product system.
Yes, absolutely.
So the product system in the Apple has iTunes, it has its OS, it has all the various different services that it sells you, and now iMoney and all that sort of stuff. And I suppose, the iPhone itself has now become eyewitness in terms of surveillance capitalism, in terms of how it monitors our every move and all of the data that is generated as a result of that. And that's a high level of sophistication, and that's a high level of complexity, because there's huge amounts of data that all need to be processed, etc. And that, but the thing about it is, we would imagine, if I was still working on operating in that kind of analog paradigm, and not the binary digital paradigm that we're currently in, it would be unmanageable to be able to process that information.
Absolutely,
but what has happened? But you see, what has happened is exactly what has happened in my experience, which is, even early media, even print media, using something like Quark Express, which was on a Macintosh, which was how you would produce long before InDesign or any of the Adobe suites.
Yes.
They had a serious number of keystrokes. It has a huge kind of menu of very almost esoteric knowledge required in order to be able to produce this thing, and what has happened. I remember
those days,
and what has happened, of course, is that we constantly get abstracted from that now, right? So we're getting abstracted from the complexity. So, I mean, in the marketer's world, the ideal sort of application is a big red button that says buy now, and so what is required of the consumer is to one action, which is to press my thumb on this button. And that is sort of like the holy grail for a lot of marketers, because what we're doing is you're reducing down the interaction of just a simple tactile, very quick millisecond decision to interact with this piece of technology. And so we've gone from technological interaction that involved complexity, a set of knowledge, and then probably relatively complex, slow processes that the vast majority of people couldn't understand and so therefore couldn't interact with. But now with the development of all these various different, in the first instance, operating systems, and then platforms on top of those operating systems, and then even apps and Windows, etc., and pop-ups and stuff, the interactions that occur now between the average Joe on the internet or through the phone, because let's be honest, most of the I remember many years ago, the Eric Smith said, like, you're never too late to be early in mobile. You know what I mean? And people kind of laugh. People kind of went, yeah, well, what's all that about? And we're still at that point. We're still, it's still not too late to do things with mobile phones that haven't been done before. I mean, there's a very famous. So we're in this kind of innovation cycle where technology is playing a central role. And a number of years ago, I was at a conference in NUIG, and at the end of it, I was asked. The question I was asked was like, so where do you see the future of electronic literature and digital creativity? And I said, well, the future, ironically, is all about the human. And people looked at me and and people looked at me and said, like, well, that's not the answer I wanted, nor is it the answer I expected. But as we know, these technologies, what they're doing is they're using the data that we provide freely to them on a massive scale to model human behavior. So there's a funny, like, one of the things we said we'd probably end up talking about today would be gamification. The application of kind of games rules, mechanics, and all that sort of stuff. And you see, part of the issue for me, of course, is, as I'm sure, I think you had Christy Dana on here at one point. You certainly would have some people from computer games, my own kind of background. Part of the issue is that you hear people talking quite a lot about the magic circle. Because that's the concept. That's the concept that's applied to kind of gaming in general. Is that we enter into this other world. We enter into that has its own rules, and of course, so people like you and I who are interested in stories, who are interested in, the Jeff Gomez world building transmedia type, or Alison Norrington's ideas around world building and transmedia storytelling, etc. This is something that has obviously existed from chess or before. That we are in this world that has a different set of rules, and we actually step into that. Now, early researchers like Brian Sutton Smith, he's not that early, but someone like Hussinger, who looked at the early game playing man, or Homo ludens, from ludology and all that sort of idea. He didn't define it as a magic circle. It was actually defined as a sacred circle. Right, and I'm kind of coming full circle back around to your question now about digital vitalism, if you don't mind. Right, so he defined it as a sacred circle, and this is something that I'm interested in terms of these abstractions that occur. I mean, we've all read about Mihaly, and the ideas of creativity, flow, and invention, and we get into that flow of creativity where we exclude the world, and we're in our own internal new sort of space, mental space or emotional mental space that allows us to, even intellectual space, I suppose, that allows us to progress what we're doing. So we've all been in that flow, whether it's playing a game, listening to an opera, watching an opera, listening to Mozart, or, drawing, painting, writing a story. We've all been in that space. And part of that space, it resembles the sacred circle. So you're in a particular kind of emotional state, or you're in a particular psychological state, I suppose, that allows you to connect with what Seamus Heaney, the Irish Nobel-winning poet, called the deep well. So you connect with some kind of it's kind of Jungian, I suppose, in some sense, or it's certain Freudian, that you're connecting with a subconscious or an unconscious or some part of yourself. And so digital vitalism was about that question, was about if you use technology to create things. Traditionally we think of the binary of the live person and the dead computer tool. Because as programmers, one of the things you learned at the beginning is garbage in, garbage out. You know what I mean? So it depends on what your inputs are. You can't make a silk Porsche out of
for sure.
Yeah, you can't make a silk Porsche out of a sow's ear. So if you put rubbish into the program, you're going to get rubbish out of it, no matter what what fantastic algorithms you've written or structures that you've created or code that you've. And so this was all part of my own explanation, my own explorations of the relationship between a creative person and technology. And so so there is a theory there around that, but I couldn't just present the theory, so I decided to personify the theory. And what I did was, you tell the story. It's if you've got a story to tell, sometimes it's good to have, as we know, a good character to tell the story that people can relate to. And one of the things that we learn in marketing, of course, about brands. A guy called Dallin, who writes quite a lot about brand narrative. So that we create these stories, and this is something that you do with companies, with your own business. Sure. You help them tell their own story in a way that allows them to connect better with their. It's not simple customer relationship management. It's about redefining the brand, and brands are about values, beliefs, and rituals. Which is funny enough what tribes are about as well. Communities can be about. So this is why brands and all that sort of stuff connect so well. But people connect with people. That's especially in this age of surveillance capitalism, especially in this age of everything I do is being monitored and possibly monetized by an algorithm somewhere that's connected to a cloud. These are all stuff that this is all stuff that I would have explored with businesses and explored in my teaching as well, around the commercial exploitation of these ideas for profit.
Do you feel that people are becoming more savvy regarding this, though? Or is it that algorithms and what the things created to make use of what people's basically gut reactions to different kind of inputs and different kind of exposures and experiences? Do you feel that people are becoming more savvy regarding this, or are marketing still a step ahead? Do they still get us to react the way they want us to react and get the rise out of us that they would want to?
Well, I think that, something like the Cambridge Analytica scandal was a fantastic development in terms of, the revolution, by the way, will be a revolution like most others, in that it will begin with non-cooperation. And I think the non-cooperation will be, no, you can't have my data. And you know what? It doesn't matter how attractive this particular platform is. I'm not going to participate because I know what you're going to do is you're going to start behaviorally modeling based on, and then, my dopamine levels will be affected. And we know, one of the things that, every cycle, you hear, the latest one is, of course, that data is the new oil. No, it isn't. It's actually worse than oil because when you burn off oil, that's it. It's gone, and we've put all the monoxides and all the undesirable chemicals into the difficulty with that is you can reprocess it and go through all that again, so we can burn up even more energy double checking our analysis, and unfortunately we have become entirely obsessed with analytics, because large companies like Walmart, Tesco, major chains, they monitor every sale. So they monitor customer buyer patterns and behavioral patterns and meteorological conditions and road temperatures and all sorts of stuff, so that they know, because we're doing just-in-time management, we're doing supply chain management. Every time we save ourselves a percentage of a penny, it's all about scale and the profitability of scale, which is, back to the Kevin Kelly thing about the long tail, and you'll always find a critical mass of people on the internet who will connect with what it is that you're doing. And I think that that's fairly true in a relatively uneducated society. But today's society, one of the benefits of access to information, of course, would be that you would be able to make a rational decision based on the information provided to you. But unfortunately for us, we live in an era of misinformation, false information, fake news, all that sort of stuff. And, so people's what constitutes veracity, truth in your data today, So these are all questions. These are all fantastic questions, and I mean, a lot of the answers now, of course, are provided by people who know nothing about, who know absolutely nothing about programming or nothing about technology, but they have a fantastic line in Patter about artificial intelligence and what constitutes artificial intelligence. I used to teach my students about ELISA, the the Rogerian therapist thing, because of where I read that, because we shape the tools and the tools shape us, which of course was attributed to McLuhan, but was actually his uncle who said it, believe it or not. But that is reiterated again. I think it's Weizenbaum who wrote about that and said that, well, if you, and this is something that if you have I know you do fishing, no? You do a lot of fishing, don't you? Or you did do a lot of fishing.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, now you probably do, you do ice fishing, which is a somewhat different thing than if you're going trout fishing in Ireland. You can get into a boat and you row out into the middle of a lake and off you go, right? And one of the things that he talks about, of course, is this idea of an oar. An oar is just a lump of wood to the average Joe Soap, but if you are a rower, if you are somebody who, then it is one of those kind of extensions of you, as McLuhan would say. And as well as that, the shape of your oar and how it's been made over time will shape your own stroke with that oar. Yeah. So we use the tools and the tools use us. And what is happening here is that the tools that we're currently using are, especially on the larger platforms, are being configured in a way that actually manipulates us, that manipulates our behaviors. And that's part of what came out in that Hooked book. So I think that, part of the revolution that I'm talking about is that I remember that there's a fantastic line of Groucho Marx, of course, that said, authenticity, if you can fake that, you've got it made, and that is, and that's where all of this leads to. It leads to trust, truth, and authenticity. And how can you do that? Well, I mean, the only way you can do that is to be, completely and utterly ethical. And to be transparent and to not steal people's information and not manipulate people. Yeah. And so we're probably in an adolescent stage of all these platforms, if we're even that far. The sophistication of these things in a number of years' time. It's interesting when I hear people talk about, I'm looking 5 years ahead, I'm looking 10 years ahead. I mean, there's pretty pointless looking beyond 9 months, truthfully, because that's the cycle, scope, and we know that, the hardware software kind of cycle where the hardware is going to get more sophisticated, double in speed and half in price. He said 18 months more, but it's probably around 9 months now, because even that cycle itself has speeded up.
So just because I've been what rings true to me is what I've been talking to people about, that it's more valuable, instead of trying to reach a mass audience, than instead trying to have a core niche of the audience, and through them, then if your product or your story or whatever it is that you're creating, if it holds up through that bit part of the audience, you can reach the masses. But like a core, as you were relating to what you were just talking about, then like sincerity is a word that I kind of like when it comes to trying to reach people with whatever it is that they need to be reached with. In order to have some form of longevity with a message or with a product or with a story or a brand or what have you.
Well, sincerity is a fantastic word, to be sincere. But I mean, part of the difficulty around being you can be absolutely sincere and be very wrong. I mean, one of the things that really gets me is this concept of passion. I am passionate about. Now, I can say this from the perspective of being an expert, right? Because there's two ways to be an expert. One is to write a book, and the other one is to do a PhD. And I've done both, so I can call myself an expert. Now, the only thing I'm actually expert in, despite all the kind of knowledge I have, is me. And know thyself is obviously the most difficult challenge of all, is to actually know who you really are and what. So some people who are very, very sincere are like some of those people who are very, very passionate about things. It comes from a good place, and they are well-meaning, and they are being sincere, but it's not worth a hill of beans, because fundamentally, being passionate about something, I can be passionate about something, but be really bloody well terrible at it. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? I can be passionate about crocheting, but I can keep sticking myself with the needle. You know what I mean? So there's a lot more goes on. I think the word sincerity is absolutely, it's part of a vocabulary that should start to. These words have been in business a long, long time, but then so has snake oil. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I mean, and the other thing too is the pressures that are on businesses today compared to. No one is content to make a living anymore. Everybody wants to rule the world, as Tears for Fears would say. Yeah. And I think that comes across. No matter how sincere you are, ambition will leak into it somewhere. I mean, I'm at the point where I really don't care anymore. Not that I ever really did, as I'm sure you know. But there's a fantastic book came out many years ago I read called "Don't Ever Get Famous," and it was probably the best advice ever. Because it's nice to have a small cadre of people who believe in what you do, because you're doing it with that sincerity you talk about, but you're doing it openly, you're doing it transparently. You are, for sure, and you're all, and I mean, back in 1999, I mentioned this previously. I was invited to Tokyo by Sony to hear about the PlayStation 2 development specifications and learn about the IDE and all that sort of stuff. And it was done under the cover of the celebration of the 50 millionth sale of a PlayStation, 50 million PlayStations sold. But we were all there to learn about the PlayStation 2, etc. and all that. And I developed a game at the time called Danger McGee, the Irish Eco Warrior Goose. And I spent a considerable amount of money on it, and I basically hawked my house, and I put everything I had into it. And I went to Ubisoft in France because I had met Yves Guillemot in the Atani Hotel in Tokyo, and he said, "Yeah, you should talk to my people about what you're doing." So I did, and I ended up talking to a third-party acquisition guy in the UK, and they said, "We love this. This is fantastic. This is an eco warrior goose." So this is a guy who you're playing a main character here who is trying to save the planet by destroying some of the industrial systems. And of course, all these various different systems had dependencies and everything else. So it was quite a complex game, but it was a fun platform or laugh along. And it was the first one ever to use Havoc's physics engine, because we were partnered up with them when they were called Telekinesis Research. Mm-hmm. And, they loved it. And I got 50% of the budget, 50% of the development budget pledged to me by Ubisoft. Sony loved it. And then I went out to the venture capital community, and nobody understood it. Mm-hmm. And the question, and this is what I heard, really, this is what I heard. Who is interested in games? who is interested in the environment?
Yeah.
You know, and for me, that's exactly 20 years ago. That's exactly 20 years ago. You know, so I mean, I'm used to people completely and utterly ignoring what I say, and I mean, and that's the old thing about, you know, first they mock you, then they laugh at you, and, you know, then they fear you or whatever it is. I can't remember exactly. I mean, I don't give a shit about any of that. I'm sorry for cursing, but you know, I'm just happy to be happy, you know, and you have to make your mind up. You have to make your mind up to be happy. Can I just finish the thing on digital vitalism, if you don't mind?
Yes, of course. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So I end up, and this is something that you mentioned to me earlier about the keynote address I did in University College Cork there back in July. And I also did a traversal of, because they wanted to archive it in the Electronic Literature Lab in Washington State University. So they asked me to actually just do a quick run through some of the work. Now, the work is just a website called digitalvitalism.com, right? But what it is it's the story of Ireland's first digital poet. And it's about how he comes to the realization of his love of technology. It's something that Bruno Latour has written about, obviously, on a philosophical level. But this is about telling the story of a person's creative engagement with technology and where they end up. So he starts off writing brick poems. So he starts off writing code in the back of a van, and he ends up creating ludic poetry in the vein of kind of Persian Sufi poetry that you play the poetry game, and there's video poetry in there and all sorts of other interactive poetry, etc. And it shows his oeuvre and it shows his development as an artist. And what it does is, but it's also a narrative. It's an inversion of Nabokov's Pale Fire. Which, of course, is something that we hear all the time when we talk about narrative, when we talk about interactive narrative, when we talk about the concept of reformed assumptions in narrative. You know, as we progress through stories, we like to be, we like some things to be reinforced, but we also like to have our assumptions challenged and changed as we make progress. You know, so that's those sorts of things. So, you know, I wrote my first computer game in 1983. It was a very simple branch and narrative thing called Lost in Kuluk. I wrote it in BASIC on a Commodore 64, and you know, you would have imagined that it's, which is why I said to you, you know, if you remember when we met in. I think it was 2008 in MIP. You were doing your thing, which was fantastic, and I had just spent quite a significant amount of money on doing my thing, which again, people said, I don't understand. What do you mean by transmedia? What do you mean by interactive narrative?
Yes.
And how can we possibly have interactive narrative on television?
No, that's impossible.
Yeah. So, and that's what this all comes down to. And I mean, it's the question that you asked me about niche and tribes and groups and brand aficionados and different ways that people sort of congregate around ideas and congregate around values, beliefs, rituals. That seems to be true, but it's not actually true. Because what we're really dealing with is we're dealing with personalization. You know, it depends. Like, you know, the first rule of Dunning-Kruger Club is you don't know you're in Dunning-Kruger Club. You know, and so there's a vast majority of people out there, and you know, for want of a better phrase, and I don't mean this to insult them, but they're gullible. And they're gullible in the sense that they don't possess enough information. And if they do have the information, they don't possess their own individual, intellectual power to be able to process it in a way that says, this is something I should do or this is something I shouldn't do. They can't make informed decisions about interactions with technology because they accept it at face value. The trust is there. And that's what a lot of these companies are aiming for. The likes of you and I, who are completely media literate, who understand, you know, the back end of things, you know, because most web and media technological instances are around, you know, back end databases and networks, and then front end UX stuff about, Nielsen's heuristics, all that sort of idea about how do you create systems that people feel comfortable within.
Yes.
But you and I know that, Simon, and the average Joe Soap doesn't. So it's not even about. So those people will willingly gravitate to groups because, in some senses, they're going to the groups because they need reassurance. They need to be told that you do know about what you're doing. You are welcome here. We do have a kind of a common bond. We do have common values, etc. But really, where all of this is going, and where it is at the moment, is it's going back to the human and the individual personalizations. So all of that kind of mass media marketing that we do, when we think about all of the the marketing mixes, and it comes down to the individual human. And of course, as marketing professionals, we have a full range of marketing technologies that allow us to do that allow us to around advertising and promotion, content and experience, all that sort of stuff. And that's all part of today's marketing technology landscape. In 2015, there was a fantastic cover of the Harvard Business Review, said the rise of the marketing technologist. So it's no good to come with your So so there's no need for you to come with you can come armed with your MBA, and in parentheses afterwards, marketing after it. And so I have a Master of Business Administration in marketing, but unless I actually have a full understanding of the kind of technological aspects of contemporary marketing, I'm a bit of a dinosaur already. So that's why there was a huge wave then of digital marketing initiatives, of the move to, and I mean, there's some central things in there that people just simply don't understand, and it's not because it's just never been pointed out to them. It's
a little bit of a herd mentality, though. I mean, it's in the same way that if you get the sponsored Facebook message that tells you should join this and this group that talks about this and these issues, and you see that 5 of your friends are already members, then you go like, oh, I could probably join that group since those people are there. And you sort of like give up a bit of your own independence and your self-sufficiency into the hands of a notion of if everyone else is doing it, then it must be okay.
Yeah, but you see, these are all based on value judgments that we make when we interact with technology. And I mean, the problem about that is it's back to this whole concept of you and I can make informed judgments because in some senses we've seen behind the curtain. So we're not still staring at the Great Oz. We know where the levers are and we see the people pulling them. So we're not enamored with that whole concept of spectacle. And like that guide aboard idea about spectacle, which, a lot of us, if you look into sort of like, visual theory, etc., you end up eventually looking at the society of spectacle. And one of the things about spectacle is it's actually a social phenomena. Mm-hmm. So we love that. We all, and I mean, tell any filmmaker why do people sit in a dark room and look at films together? Even though recently I've read, well, people aren't doing it anymore. It's really a lot of films are being made for children because and young adolescents because they're the only ones really going to the movies now. Mm-hmm, yeah. And this is central to all of this, right? Let me talk about 2 things, Simon. Right, one is the concept of the home as sanctuary.
Yeah.
Okay. And I remember many years ago when I began looking at console development, because I'd been in kind of like PC development. I was looking at console development. There was a fantastic article written around 1994, I think 95, called "The Battle for the Living Room." Okay, and that was about which device in our living room will be the kind of central hub. Will it be the telephone? Will it be the now this is 1995, so 96 was really when the internet became the World Wide Web and actually became what we know today as the internet, or Web 2 maybe, or Web 3 or whatever it is we're calling it this way. So that concept that in your sanctuary there was going to be a particular device that would allow you to create and consume media. or the family to create and consume media. Where it was going to be was it was going to be in the home, in the sanctuary. I think part of the difficulty that we have in this kind of age of surveillance capitalism is that every device that we have now has the capacity to track us and has the capacity, and specifically in the home. I mean, and if you go and read that book I was speaking about, she cites a thermostatic control that was used in the Home Aware project in one of the universities in might have been Georgia Tech, not quite sure, where they were doing smart home stuff. Because the smart home market is supposed to be like by 2023 it's going to be 36 billion. So that sounds like an attractive market for a lot of capitalists. Let's get in there and grab some of the market share in there. So there's a drive towards controlling the information flow in the home that is traditionally a sanctuary. And part of the difficulty, part of the kind of doors that people use to access that is this idea, as you just described it, of here's a group with my friends in it, friends whom I trust. How does this come about? How do we make these value judgments about stuff like this? I mean, it's very simple, and I'm sorry to kind of go back into the kind of marketing world for a second, but when we look at people making judgments, one of the major yourself from running projects, quality, time, and cost are always the controls in a project. Quality, time, cost, and scope, right? Scope, yeah. But yeah, and for a lot of differentiators now in a saturated market, quality is the defining thing. Quality is if it's the quality I want, then I'm prepared to pay a little bit more, and I'll wait a little bit longer if I have to. If it's the quality that I want, that's presuming you're not that price sensitive or whatever it is, But we understand that. We understand that price is just part of a value exchange as well, right? So looking at value exchange. How do we determine the value? How do we determine quality and what is going to be? If you're looking at a pair of new skis to go fishing, and you're not really familiar with the brand, but there is a picture of the skis on the net, and it shows their weight and it shows their finish, and I know nothing about skis, so you can stop me at any stage here. But basically, you can judge the quality of the skis by looking at them and by reading information, right? So what you have there is you have a product that is high in search qualities.
Yes.
Okay, so so you have a product there that's high in search qualities, and you're saying, and that can be true as well for television series. It can be true for because you look at a cast list that has all people who you've in some way connected with, or you're a fan of, or you've seen the prior work and you like what they did, or they have a particular so the ingredients of the product are on show, whatever the type of product is. And then we get into concepts like food and entertainment that you have to experience. Okay, you have to experience these things in order to be able to make a judgment about their quality. So if I go and I have a really nice dinner in a Michelin-starred restaurant, and I enjoy it immensely, I can tell by the flavors and the tastes and how I felt afterwards, and the bill, just how much quality was involved in that. But then we get into, and this is where it gets really interesting, right? Then we get into the whole concept of SME. Of specialist offerings, of subject matter stuff, of anything from auto dentistry to accounting. Take for instance accounting, right? You have a fantastic accountant that works for your company, Simon. He does a fantastic job for you, does he? Well, unless you yourself are an accountant, you don't really know. The only way you're going to judge is at the end of the year if the taxman says, "Oh, look, we owe you some money." You go, "Gee, I have a fantastic accountant," or if you get a extra demand for tax. You haven't paid enough VAT or whatever it is. You go, that accountant, he's rubbish. He's not what I thought he was. You know what I mean? So you can't really judge, even though you've experienced the service, even though you've experienced the product, you still can't judge the quality of it. Right? Because you're waiting for some kind of final outcome that's even after the fact, probably after you've paid and all of that sort of stuff. Now, those qualities, credence qualities, as they're called, right? Those credence qualities are, we rely. So, I was chatting with Simon. He says he's the best. He doesn't have to pay any tax for the next 3 years because of his accountant, what his accountant has set up for him. Fantastic. He must be doing all that corporation tax stuff in Dublin again. You know what I mean? He has set it up. So I want to use that guy. Because Simon recommends him and I trust Simon. Right? So the sincerity is not coming from the provider of the service or the service itself. It's coming from Simon, because he's in kind of like my trust circle, or he is somebody whom I respect. I respect his opinion, and I respect more so than his opinion, the storytelling around his experiences. Mm-hmm. So this is why we decide to click on. It's because of the people who we trust, because they're the ones that provide us with credence qualities information when it comes to those things that we haven't experienced or those things that we don't know. So I mean, these are huge, and this is where AI comes in, of course, because AI is used quite a lot in recommendation systems.
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
Used, so it's used to filter out. And the thing is, if you're like me, if somebody says, this is the most fantastic thing I've ever seen, I've never enjoyed anything as much, I'm going, my natural skeptic, that old it's a guy called Jeffrey Wagner who wrote a fantastic book called The Wisdom of Words, and he talks about that, where he talks about the spoonerisms and the double negative equal and a positive. So right, as the double positive equal the negative, so right to all of that, Simon.
Yeah. So I have to ask you one final question, because I'm anxious of not running the podcast too long, but I'd love to have you on again, because there's a lot of stuff to delve into. I feel we only just scratched the surface. But going back to what you were talking about, back in the days, trying to talk to people about your game, trying to talk to people about your transmedia project, people in acquisition positions or in any other positions in those companies, not getting it. Is there anything that you feel that you're talking about now that people are not getting, but they will be getting in, say, 10, 15 years' time?
This is, absolutely. I mean, like what's happened for me is I spent the last number of years as a course director in Dublin Business School over quite a significant cohort of students, courses, staff, all that sort of stuff. So I mean, there's been an aggregation of my own kind of experiences of the Americans say fail is first attempt in learning and all that sort of stuff. And I worked a lot with researchers and PhD people when I was there's a place called the Innovation Academy, the UCD TCD Innovation Academy. So I would have did it's not, some of the stuff isn't fully formed, so if I sound a little bit kind of like a lunatic, it's just because it's still so I went back with masters and PhDs and degrees and all sorts of stuff and lots of different experience, from selling t-shirts off my arm at concerts to running some of the major flagship titles for Microsoft PC and Xbox, and working on very significant pressurized products and stuff like that, and development cycles, etc. I look at this question about who pathfinding is really what it's about. Like, so where is, like, we all trod the path. Oh, there, the gold is over this way. So in those gold rushes, the path towards where we're all going to start mining is well worn by those that come before us. And along the way, the people who make the money are the people who are selling us the tools to prospect. Bill Gates said that many years ago about, in gold rushes, it's the people who sell the picks and shovels that make all the money, not the people digging in the ground. Like,
naturally.
But, this may sound but I cannot see the system as it's currently constituted. I mean, what's the window that you're talking about? Like, what I'm working on at the moment is I'm working on a different reality ideas. Okay. And what I'd say about that is that, that in 2006, the company I had was Digital Interactive Media Enterprises, right? And people were saying to me, digital interactive media? What's that? Like, and I was saying, well, like I've had CleverCelt as a site since 1996. So that's me as a digital artist doing stuff I don't care about, in terms of, I don't care how it's received. That's me experimenting with what it is I want to do,
for sure.
And I've no need. My locus of evaluation is firmly within me, so I don't need people to endorse me and tell me, oh, you're fantastic, or this is great, but I actually have, I'm part of a new startup called Fantastic.
Oh, that's a great name.
Well, actually, and I have the fantastic.ie URL and all that sort of stuff. And because we're based in Dublin, and as I said previously, before we kind of started recording, was, the Silicon Dock stuff going on. And we've got a huge ecosystem here for AI, for, fintech is huge here at the minute, all the DLT stuff that we do. So digital disruption, but people are still talking about, the move from bricks and mortar business to the move into, the information, the information society that we're definitely living in, or this, again, to borrow that phrase, the surveillance capitalism that we live in, and I think capitalism as a model. And we can see this through crowdfunding and crowdsourcing, and the idea that, I have a site as well called producers.org, right, which is about people who produce and use. You know what I mean? And rather than being a scenario whereby I charge you and you charge me and all that sort of stuff, I'll make something and you can use it, but then I need to get some of yours. So kind of almost like a barter system or whatever else. Because I think that the monetization and how that is going in terms of making money and what makes you happy. I know it's always preferable to cry in the back of a Mercedes than in a Ford Fiesta.
That's
you know what
saying. I could agree, I think.
But there does come a point where people yearn for more meaningful exchange. I think that that's what Fantastic is about. At some level, it's about more meaningful exchange. And there's a friend of mine. If you think about the logocentrism or logotherapy, or Viktor Frankl's ideas about meaning and search for meaning, and that's fundamentally what we are, Simon, is we're meaning-making machines. We walk into any kind of environment, and the first thing we want to know is, what does this mean, or what does it mean to me, possibly, which is more. And those are the kind of ideas that I haven't really elaborated or elucidated on exactly what we're doing, but it's not exactly AR and it's not exactly VR, but it is otherworldly stuff, is what I would say, and it's about otherness, and it's not, when I talk about otherness, I don't mean in that kind of uncanny valley sense. I mean in the Michael Joyce sense of other-mindedness, in terms of, like, what I thought I had to do was there's a certain irony in this too, of course, is that we were going to talk a lot about AI today and AI strategies and stuff like that. We never touched on any of it.
Next time. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, like, it's funny because at a very, very basic level, stand-up comedians do it all the time. They create worlds with each individual joke and they invite you into them, and most people go willingly because of what they're going to get from it. And they don't get money. As a matter of fact, they've paid to listen to this person in most instances. So there's those ideas about what entices people to exchange.
Yes.
And increasingly, I think people are becoming more and more wary of the simple capitalist exchange, because we, I think, as a society, feel we never win in that regard, because
it's not worth it. It's basically.
Yeah. So what I'm looking at is modes of exchange that, obviously the company has to survive and live as a company, so it needs to be fed with money, but money comes in various different forms. It's not all about marketers are no longer interested in transactional value anyway. Transactional value is the lowest form of communication. What we want is relational value. We want to be able to, and every company that's out there is doing it, is they're trying to build loyalty, they're trying to build connection, they're trying to build relationships with people who in some way find resonance with their brand, or they find, and so, I mean, that's, it's odd that I would talk about Fantastic as a brand, because maybe I would say it's probably an anti-brand.
And perhaps that's the future of brands. Yes. Fascinating talk, Michael. And audio, AI, I'm writing these things down as topics for our next talk.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast, and have a lovely, what is it, Wednesday? Yeah.
All day, apparently.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.